Today, we are starting with the case of Jane Clausen. Eltham, London, 1871. The night of April 25th, 1871, was cold, clinging to the dampness that often defined the outskirts of Victorian London. In the quiet, rural stretch of Kidbrooke Lane in Eltham, the shadows were long and the gaslights were few. This was an era of strict social hierarchies and rigid morality, where a person's reputation was often more valuable than their life. But on this particular night, the silence of the lane was shattered by a discovery that would grip the British public and expose the dark underbelly of middle-class respectability. A local police constable, patrolling his beat in the early hours of the morning, noticed something out of place near a gate. At first, it looked like a bundle of discarded rags, perhaps dropped by a passing cart. But as he drew closer, the beam of his lantern revealed a much more horrific reality. Lying in the mud was a young woman. She was still alive, but barely. Her face had been pulverized by a series of devastating blows. Her skull fractured so severely that it was a miracle she was breathing at all. Her clothes were torn, and she was covered in blood and grime, her fingers clutching at the earth as if trying to hold onto a life that was rapidly slipping away. She was rushed to Guy's Hospital, a journey that must have been agonizing. For several days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to speak, her eyes swollen shut. The nurses and doctors could do little but try to comfort her. Despite the gravity of her injuries, she managed to linger for 5 days. Before she succumbed to her wounds, she whispered a few final, haunting words to a nurse. She spoke of a man. She spoke of a betrayal. And then Jane Maria Clausen, only 17 years old, was gone. The investigation began immediately, and the police didn't have to look far for a lead. Jane had been a domestic servant, a common role for young women of her station. She had recently been employed by the Pook family in Greenwich. Ebenezer Pook was a well-to-do tradesman, a printer and bookseller who lived a comfortable, suburban life with his wife and children. Among those children was his 20-year-old son, Edmund Walter Pook. Jane had been dismissed from the Pook household just weeks before her murder. The official reason given was slovenliness, a catch-all term often used to get rid of staff without cause. However, rumors quickly began to swirl in the local community. Jane, it was whispered, had become far too close to the young master of the house, Edmund. In an age where a servant's virtue was her only currency, such a connection was scandalous. Even more damning was the revelation from the post-mortem examination. Jane Clausen had been 2 months pregnant at the time of her death. The narrative of the case began to take shape. A young girl, vulnerable and working far from home, found herself in a secret relationship with the son of her employer. When the inevitable happened, the power dynamics shifted. For Jane, it was a catastrophe. For Edmund, it was a threat to his future, his family's standing, and his inheritance. The police turned their full attention to Edmund Pook. They found that on the night of the murder, Edmund had been seen out late. Witnesses placed a man matching his description near Kidbrooke Lane, looking agitated and disheveled. One witness, a local gardener, described seeing a young man running from the direction of the lane, stopping to brush mud from his trousers. Even more incriminating was the discovery of a weapon. A hammer, stained with blood and matted hair, was found hidden in a nearby field. The police tracked the purchase of this tool back to a local ironmonger. The shopkeeper's daughter identified Edmund Pook as the man who had bought that very hammer just days before the attack. She was certain of it. His appearance was distinctive, and his manner had been nervous. As the evidence mounted, Edmund was arrested. The public was captivated. This wasn't just a murder. It was a melodrama played out in real life. It had all the elements the Victorian public craved. A tragic victim, a wealthy villain, and a forbidden romance. Thousands of people flocked to Eltham to see the spot where Jane had been found. Her funeral became a massive public event, with tens of thousands of mourners lining the streets to pay their respects to the poor girl of Eltham. She became a symbol of the exploited working class, a victim of a system that allowed the powerful to prey on the weak. However, as the case moved toward trial, the tide began to turn in a way that many found deeply unsettling. The Pook family was not about to let their son go to the gallows without a fight. They hired the best legal counsel money could buy, and they used their influence to chip away at the prosecution's case. The trial of Edmund Pook opened at the Old Bailey in July 1871, presided over by Lord Chief Justice Bovell. From the beginning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged. The prosecution presented their circumstantial evidence: the pregnancy, the secret letters Jane had told her friends about, the sightings of Edmund near the scene, and the blood-stained hammer. They argued that Edmund had lured Jane to the secluded lane under the guise of discussing their future, only to silence her forever. But the defense was formidable. They focused on the inconsistencies in witness testimonies. They questioned the reliability of the ironmonger's daughter, suggesting she was mistaken or had been pressured by the police. They produced their own witnesses who claimed Edmund had been at home or in a different part of town at the time of the murder. Most critically, the defense challenged the evidence regarding the blood. In 1871, forensic science was in its infancy. While investigators found dark stains on Edmund's clothing, his lawyers argued they were nothing more than ink from his father's printing shop. Without the ability to perform DNA testing or even reliable blood typing, the prosecution was left with a he said, she said scenario. Then there was the matter of the letters. Jane had told her roommates and friends that she was in love with Edmund and that they had been exchanging secret notes. She had even shown them a locket she claimed he had given her. However, when Jane's belongings were searched, no letters from Edmund were found. The defense used this to paint Jane as a delusional young woman who had invented a romance with a man far above her station. They suggested that the pregnancy was the result of a different, unknown lover, and that Jane had been using Edmund's name to save her own reputation. The judge's behavior during the trial became a point of major controversy. Lord Chief Justice Bovell seemed openly sympathetic to the defendant. He frequently interrupted the prosecution and gave instructions to the jury that heavily favored the defense. He dismissed the dying declaration Jane had made to the nurse, ruling it inadmissible because she hadn't explicitly stated she knew she was dying, a legal technicality that silenced the victim one last time. In his final summary, Bovell essentially told the jury that the prosecution had failed to prove their case beyond a shadow of a doubt. He emphasized Edmund's good character and the unreliability of the working-class witnesses who had testified against him. The jury took only 20 minutes to reach a verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. While the Pook family celebrated, the public was outraged. When Edmund Pook left the courthouse, he had to be escorted by police to protect him from a lynch mob. The not guilty verdict was seen by many as a gross miscarriage of justice, a sign that the law was designed to protect the wealthy and punish the poor. The aftermath of the trial was chaotic. Riots broke out in Greenwich and Eltham. Effigies of Edmund Pook and the judge were burned in the streets. The Pook family was forced to flee their home as angry crowds threw stones through their windows. The press was divided, but the more populist newspapers continued to investigate, printing stories about Edmund's history of inappropriate behavior toward other female servants. Years later, more information began to surface that suggested the investigation had been even more botched than initially realized. It was discovered that Edmund's brother, William, had also been seen in the area that night, and some wondered if the family had conspired to cover up the crime. Others pointed to the fact that Edmund's clothing had been washed immediately after the murder, a detail that the defense had managed to gloss over during the trial. Despite the acquittal, Edmund Pook could never escape the shadow of Kidbrooke Lane. He changed his name and moved away, trying to disappear into anonymity. But the Eltham murder remained one of the most famous cases of the century. Jane Clausen's story didn't end with the trial. The public's sympathy for her was so great that a fund was raised to build a memorial. To this day, in Brockley Cemetery, a white marble monument stands over her grave. It depicts a grieving figure and bears an inscription that tells of her cruel murder. It stands as a silent protest against the verdict that let her killer walk free. As we look back at the case of Jane Clausen, we see more than just a Victorian tragedy. We see the limitations of early forensic science, where a few drops of ink could be used to hide the stains of a violent crime. We see the immense power of social class, where the word of a printer's son carried more weight than the dying whispers of a servant girl. And we see the beginning of a shift in public consciousness, where the common people began to demand that justice be blind to wealth and status. The lane where Jane was found has long since been paved over, and the rural fields of Eltham are now busy London suburbs. But the story of a 17-year-old girl who dreamed of a better life, only to find a nightmare in the dark, still resonates. It reminds us that behind every true crime headline is a human life cut short, and a search for truth that sometimes takes centuries to resolve. Jane Clausen was a girl who had nothing but her reputation and her hope. In the end, both were taken from her. The legal system of 1871 may have declared Edmund Hook innocent, but the court of history remains much more skeptical. We are left with the image of a blood-stained hammer, a hidden pregnancy, and a young woman's final, unheard plea for justice. The case remains officially unsolved, one of the many cold cases of the Victorian era. But for those who visit the Marble Monument in Brockley, the identity of the victim is clear, and the injustice of her death remains as vivid today as it was over 150 years ago. Next story, the murder of Emily Bileby. Kingston upon Hull, 1873. The winter of 1873 in Kingston upon Hull was much like any other in the Victorian era, a period of soot, fog, and the relentless machinery of an empire. The city was a sprawling network of docks and narrow alleyways, where the air tasted of salt from the Humber and the heavy, metallic scent of the fishing industry. In the 19th century, Hull was a place of extreme contrasts. Wealth flowed through the merchant houses, while just streets away, families crowded into cramped, damp tenements, living lives of quiet, desperate struggle. It is here, in the shadow of the great shipyards, that we find Adelaide Street. It wasn't the worst place to live, but it was far from the best. It was a street where people kept their heads down and worked until their hands were raw, hoping only to keep a roof over their heads and their children fed. Among these residents was the Bileby family. James Bileby was a man who, by all outward appearances, was the picture of a Victorian working-class patriarch. He was known to his neighbors as a quiet, industrious man who earned his living as a fishmonger's assistant. He wasn't known for drink or for a quick temper. In fact, many in the community would later describe him as a devoted father, a man who seemed to find his only real joy in the presence of his children. His daughter, Emily, was just 6 years old. She was a bright spot in the gray landscape of industrial Hull, a child who was often seen clinging to her father's hand or playing near their doorstep. But beneath the surface of this seemingly mundane life, something was beginning to fracture. The pressures of poverty, the relentless grind of Victorian labor, and a creeping, silent darkness in James's mind were converging toward a point of no return. The week leading up to the middle of December 1873 had been particularly cold. The frost clung to the cobblestones, and the sun seemed to disappear almost as soon as it rose. Neighbors would later recall that James had seemed off. He wasn't himself. He was seen wandering the streets with a vacant look in his eyes, or sometimes talking to himself in hushed, urgent tones. In a world before modern psychology, these were seen as fits of the blues, or perhaps the result of a lingering fever. No one could have guessed that James was descending into a profound state of religious and paranoid delusion. He began to believe that the world was closing in on him, that his family was being targeted by unseen forces, and that the only way to save them from a life of misery was a final, terrible act of mercy. On the morning of December 15th, the Bileby household was quiet. Too quiet. A neighbor, a woman who lived in the adjoining tenement, would later testify that she hadn't heard the usual sounds of the morning, the clatter of boots or the high-pitched voice of little Emily. There was a sense of stillness that felt heavy, almost suffocating. Around mid-morning, James Bileby was seen leaving the house. He was disheveled, his clothes rumpled, and his face a mask of pale exhaustion. He didn't look like a man who had just committed a crime. He looked like a man who was already dead inside. He wandered toward the local police station, his movements slow and mechanical. When he finally stood before the officer on duty, his voice was a mere whisper. He He didn't ask for help. He simply stated, with a chilling lack of emotion, that he had done something terrible to his daughter. When the authorities arrived at the small house on Adelaide Street, they were met with a scene that would haunt the local constabulary for decades. The room was cold, the fire in the hearth having long since gone out. There, lying on the bed, was 6-year-old Emily. She looked almost as if she were sleeping, were it not for the crimson staining the sheets and the horrific wound to her neck. James had used a common straight razor, a tool found in almost every Victorian home, to end his daughter's life while she slept. There was no evidence of a struggle, no sign that the child had even realized what was happening. It was a swift, clinical, and utterly devastating act. James hadn't fled. He hadn't tried to hide the weapon. He had simply sat with her for hours before walking to the station to surrender. The arrest of James Bilby sent shockwaves through Hull. This wasn't a case of a drunken rage or a premeditated act of cruelty for gain. This was a father of the year who had suddenly, inexplicably, destroyed the person he claimed to love most. As the investigation began, the details of James's mental state started to emerge. In his cell, he would alternate between periods of catatonic silence and outbursts of religious fervor. He claimed that voices had told him Emily was too pure for this world, and that by taking her life, he was ensuring her a place in heaven, sparing her from the wickedness and starvation that awaited her in the slums of Hull. It was a classic case of what Victorian doctors called homicidal mania, a sudden, violent impulse born from a diseased mind. The inquest was held at a local public house, a common practice at the time where the community could gather to hear the grim details. The atmosphere was thick with indignation and sorrow. Witnesses spoke of James's character, painting a picture of a man who had never raised a hand to his wife or children until that fatal morning. They spoke of how he had recently lost his job and how the fear of the workhouse, the ultimate shame for a Victorian laborer, had been gnawing at his sanity. The workhouse wasn't just a place of poverty. It was a place where families were separated, where the dignity of the individual was stripped away. For a man like James, the prospect of Emily being sent to the workhouse was a fate worse than death itself. As the trial approached, the legal system of 1870s England was faced with a difficult question. The law regarding insanity was governed by the Emnaton rules, which required the defense to prove that at the time of the act, the accused did not know the nature of their actions or did not know that what they were doing was wrong. James Bilby clearly knew what he had done. He had confessed to it immediately. However, his motive was so distorted by delusion that it challenged the very definition of knowing right from wrong. He believed he was doing something right in a spiritual sense, even if he knew it was wrong in a legal sense. The trial took place at the York Assizes. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, some seeking justice for the young girl, others curious to see the monster of Adelaide Street. James stood in the dock, looking frail and bewildered. He seemed disconnected from the proceedings, often staring at the ceiling or muttering prayers under his breath. The prosecution laid out the facts with cold precision: the razor, the wound, the confession. They argued that poverty was no excuse for such an atrocity, and that James should face the highest penalty the law allowed, the gallows. They portrayed him as a man who had simply given up and taken his daughter down with him. The defense, however, called upon medical experts of the day. They argued that James was suffering from melancholia with delusions. They pointed to his history of quietness and his sudden change in behavior as evidence of a brain softened by worry and lack of nourishment. One doctor testified that James's pulse was abnormally slow and that his eyes showed the clouded vacancy typical of those whose minds had snapped under pressure. They argued that James wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense, but a victim of his own biology and circumstances. The defense contended that execution would be a further tragedy, as James was not truly responsible for the hand that held the razor. The jury's deliberation was surprisingly brief. In many cases of child killing during this era, juries were often sympathetic to mothers suffering from puerperal psychosis, but they were usually much harsher on fathers. However, the sheer lack of any traditional motive, no insurance money, no hidden anger, no history of abuse, seemed to weigh heavily on them. They returned with a verdict that reflected a growing, albeit slow, understanding of mental health. James Bileby was found not guilty on the grounds of insanity. While he had escaped the noose, his life as a free man was over. Under the Trial of Lunatics Act, James was ordered to be detained until Her Majesty's pleasure be known. This was the standard sentence for the criminally insane, and in 1873, it almost always meant a one-way trip to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. Broadmoor had opened only a decade earlier, designed specifically to house those who had committed violent acts while under the influence of mental illness. It was a fortress-like structure in Berkshire, miles away from the docks of Hull. For James, it would be his home for the remainder of his life. The records from Broadmoor provide a heartbreaking glimpse into James's final years. He was described as a model patient, quiet, hard-working in the asylum's gardens, and deeply religious. He never seemed to fully grasp the finality of what he had done, often asking the guards when Emily would be coming to visit him. He lived in a perpetual state of pious delusion, believing that he was merely waiting for a reunion in a better world. He died within the walls of the asylum years later, a forgotten man from a forgotten street. But the story of Emily Bileby didn't end with James's incarceration. Her death became a talking point in Hull for years, a grim reminder of the thin line between the working poor and the abyss of madness. It raised questions about the social safety net, or lack thereof, in Victorian England. If James had been given help when his fits of the blues first started, or if the fear of the workhouse hadn't been so pervasive, would Emily have grown up to see the turn of the century? The case highlighted the desperate need for better mental health care and the devastating impact of poverty on the human psyche. Emily was buried in a modest grave, her name etched into a stone that has likely long since weathered away or been moved. She was one of many silent victims of the Victorian era, children whose lives were cut short not by malice, but by the crushing weight of the world their parents inhabited. The house on Adelaide Street was eventually demolished as part of the city's modernization, and the physical traces of the tragedy were erased. Yet, the case remains a significant one in the annals of Hull's history, representing a moment when the legal system had to look beyond the act itself and consider the broken mind behind it. When we look back at the case of Emily Bileby, it's easy to judge James as a villain. To modern ears, the act of a father taking his child's life is the ultimate betrayal. But the reality is far more complex and far more tragic. It is a story of a man who loved his child so much that his fractured mind convinced him the only way to protect her was to destroy her. It is a story of a city that was a powerhouse of industry, but a desert of compassion for the mentally ill. And most of all, it is the story of Emily, a 6-year-old girl who became a footnote in a legal battle over the nature of sanity. Next story, the disappearance of Lord Lucan. London, England, 1974. The fog that settles over London's Belgravia district often feels like a curtain, shielding the secrets of the ultra-wealthy from the prying eyes of the street. In the early 1970s, this was a world of high-stakes gambling, aristocratic titles, and a social code that valued discretion above almost all else. But on the night of November 7th, 1974, that curtain was ripped back to reveal a scene of such domestic horror that it would spark the most enduring mystery in British legal history. It is a story of a man known as Lucky, whose luck eventually ran out in the darkest way possible, in a disappearance that turned a peer of the realm into a ghost. Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, was the very image of the mid-century British aristocrat. Tall, dashing, with a stiff upper lip and a penchant for powerboats and high-stakes backgammon. He was a fixture at the Claremont Club in Berkeley Square. His friends were the titans of the era, men like James Goldsmith and John Aspinall. To the public, Lucan lived a life of leisure and luxury. But behind the velvet ropes of the gaming clubs, the man nicknamed Lucky was anything but. He was a professional gambler who consistently lost, a man whose ancestral wealth was evaporating into a mountain of debt, and a husband trapped in a marriage that had dissolved into a bitter, vitriolic war that by 1974. Lord Lucan had moved out of the family home at 46 Lower Belgrave Street, taking up residence in a nearby flat. His wife, Veronica, Countess of Lucan, remained in the family home with their 3 children and their nanny, a young woman named Sandra Rivet. The separation had been anything but clean. Lucan was obsessed with gaining custody of his children, an obsession that drove him to the brink of financial and mental ruin. He had spent thousands on private detectives to spy on his wife and legal fees to fight her in court. He was a man backed into a corner, watching his status, his money, and his legacy slip through his fingers. The evening of November 7th began like many others for Sandra Rivet. It was a Thursday, her usual night off, but she had stayed behind to help Veronica. Around 8:55 p.m., Sandra headed down to the basement kitchen to make a cup of tea. She descended the stairs into the dimly lit lower level of the house, unaware that someone was waiting in the shadows. In the darkness of the basement, an intruder struck. The weapon was a lead pipe wrapped in blue surgical tape to provide a better grip. The attack was swift and brutal. Sandra Rivet never had a chance to scream. The assailant, likely expecting to find Lady Lucan in the kitchen, had instead killed the innocent nanny in a case of mistaken identity. Her body was placed into a large canvas mail bag, and the killer waited. Upstairs, Lady Lucan began to wonder why her tea was taking so long. She walked to the top of the basement stairs and called out Sandra's name. Receiving no answer, she descended into the darkness. As she reached the bottom, she too was attacked. A man stepped out of the gloom and struck her across the head multiple times with the same weighted pipe. But Veronica Lucan fought back. In the struggle, she managed to grab her attacker's throat and, according to her later testimony, realized with a jolt of pure terror that the man trying to kill her was her husband. She managed to calm him by telling him she would help him escape if he just stopped. She appealed to his logic, or perhaps his desperation. For a brief, surreal moment, the Earl and the Countess sat together on the stairs, the blood of the nanny just feet away in the basement. When Lucan went to the bathroom to get a towel to clean his wife's wounds, Veronica seized her chance. She bolted from the house and ran to the nearby Plumber's Arms pub, bursting through the doors covered in blood and screaming that a murder had been committed. By the time the police arrived at 46 Lower Belgrave Street, the house was silent. They found the basement covered in blood and the body of Sandra Rivet stuffed into the sack. But Lord Lucan was gone. The events that followed are where the man ends and the myth begins. Lucan did not go to the police. Instead, he drove a borrowed Ford Corsair to the town of Uckfield, about 45 miles south of London, to the home of his close friends, Ian and Susan Maxwell Scott. He arrived late, disheveled and frantic. He told Susan a story that contradicted his wife's version of events. He claimed he had been walking past the house and saw a struggle through the basement window. He said he had entered to help, slipped in a pool of blood, and that the intruder had fled. He claimed his wife was hysterical and accusing him of the crime. Despite the gravity of his story, he refused to stay. He wrote 2 letters to his brother-in-law, Bill Shan Kidd, which he left with Susan. In those letters, he spoke of a nightmarish coincidence and expressed concern for his children's future, admitting that the evidence against me is strong. Around 1:15 a.m. on November 8th, he drove away from the Maxwell Scott house. It was the last time Richard John Bingham was ever seen by anyone who would admit to it. 3 days later, the Ford Corsair was found abandoned in the port town of New Haven. The interior was stained with blood, both Type A and Type B, matching Sandra Rivet and Lord Lucan himself. In the trunk, police found a piece of lead pipe identical to the one found at the murder scene, also wrapped in blue tape. The car was parked just a short walk from the ferry terminal. The search that followed was one of the largest in the history of Scotland Yard. Detectives combed through the English Channel, believing he might have taken his own life by jumping from a boat. They raided the estates of his wealthy Claremont set friends, suspecting that the aristocratic old boy network was hiding one of their own. The theory was simple. Lucan was a man of the upper class, and his friends believed he shouldn't be subjected to the indignity of a common prison. They had the means, the private planes, and the international connections to spirit him away to a life of exile in Africa or South America. In 1975, an inquest was held into the death of Sandra Rivet. It was a landmark moment in British law. The jury took only 30 minutes to reach a verdict. Murder by Lord Lucan. He became the first member of the House of Lords to be named a murderer since the 18th century. But there was no one to arrest. Decades passed, and the sightings began. Lucan was allegedly seen in a backpacker hostel in Namibia, at a luxury resort in South Africa, and living as a hippie in Goa. Every few years, a new lead would emerge. A photograph of an elderly man who bore a resemblance to the Earl, or a deathbed confession from a former associate. None of it ever led to a definitive answer. The mystery of Lord Lucan is not just about a murder. It is about the collision of two worlds. It's about the dying gasps of an era where a title and a pedigree could supposedly protect you from the consequences of your actions. Lady Lucan spent the rest of her life in the shadow of that night, remaining in Belgravia, estranged from her children and firm in her belief that her husband had taken the easy way out in the cold waters of the Channel. She passed away in 2017, taking her side of the story to the grave, though she never wavered in her identification of the man in the basement. Was Lucan a cold-blooded killer who planned to eliminate his wife to solve his custody and financial woes, only to kill the wrong person in the dark? Or was he truly the victim of a nightmarish coincidence, as he claimed in his final letters? The evidence points heavily toward the former. The lead pipe in the trunk of his car, the matching tape, and the sheer desperation of his situation create a portrait of a man who had reached his breaking point. If he did survive the night in New Haven, how did he do it? Some believe he was helped onto a private boat and flown from a small airstrip to a remote estate in Africa, where he lived out his days under an assumed name, supported by the silent contributions of his wealthy London friends. This theory suggests a conspiracy of silence that lasted for over 40 years, a final act of loyalty from the Claremont set to a man they felt was one of them. Others believe the simplest explanation is the most likely. Lucan, a man obsessed with his own dignity and the reputation of his earldom, realized that even if he escaped the hangman, he could never escape the shame. By walking into the sea, he ensured that he would never have to stand trial, never have to face the public's judgment, and would remain forever a mystery. In 1999, Lord Lucan was officially declared dead for probate purposes, and in 2016, a death certificate was finally issued, allowing his son, George, to inherit the title. But for the family of Sandra Rivet, the young woman who just wanted to make a cup of tea on her night off, there's been no true closure. Her killer was never handcuffed, never sat in a witness box, and never had a look into the eyes of the people whose lives he destroyed. Next story, the murder of Harry Oakes. Nassau, Bahamas, 1943. The Bahamas in the early 1940s was not the tourist-heavy paradise we think of today. It was a sun-drenched, sleepy outpost of the British Empire, governed by the weight of tradition and the heavy humidity of the Caribbean. But beneath the veneer of colonial order, Nassau was a playground for the world's wealthiest elite, men and women who had fled the turmoil of World War II to hide their fortunes and their secrets in the sand. At the center of this world was Sir Harry Oakes, a man whose life read like a fever dream of the American and Canadian gold rush. Oakes was the richest man in the British Empire, a prospector who had actually found the mother lode after years of wandering the frozen wilderness of Ontario. He was a man who didn't just have money. He had the kind of wealth that could move borders and buy titles. Yet, on the morning of July 8th, 1943, that wealth would prove entirely useless as the world woke up to a scene of inexplicable horror inside his sprawling estate, Westbourne. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand Harry Oakes. He wasn't born into a silver spoon. He was a rough around the edges, cantankerous self-made man who spent 20 years living in rags, chasing the glimmer of gold in the dirt. When he finally hit the Shore gold mine, he became a multi-millionaire overnight. He moved to the Bahamas primarily to escape the crushing taxes of Canada and Britain, and in doing so, he became the island's most prominent benefactor. He built the airport, the hospitals, and provided jobs for thousands. He was knighted for his philanthropy, becoming Sir Harry. But Harry was a man of many enemies. He was stubborn, often rude, and had a volatile temper that didn't mesh well with with the polished, high society circles he now inhabited. On the night of July 7th, 1943, a violent tropical thunderstorm lashed the island of New Providence. Lightning cracked across the sky, and the wind howled through the palm trees. Inside Westbourne, Sir Harry was hosting a small, quiet evening. His wife, Lady Eunice Oakes, was away in Maine with their children. Staying with Harry was his close friend and business associate, Harold Christie. Christie was a local real estate mogul and a prominent member of the Bahamian legislature. According to Christie's later testimony, the two men had dinner, discussed business, and retired to their respective bedrooms early. Christie claimed he slept through the night, undisturbed by anything other than the crashing thunder outside. But when Christie walked into Sir Harry's bedroom the next morning to wake him for breakfast, he encountered a sight that would haunt the island for decades. The room was thick with the smell of smoke and something metallic. Sir Harry Oakes was lying on his bed, but he was barely recognizable. He had been struck 4 times behind the left ear with a blunt object, some kind of spiked hammer or tool, with such force that the wounds were deep and fatal. But the killer hadn't stopped there. In a move that suggested something far more ritualistic or vengeful than a simple robbery, Harry's body had been doused in gasoline and set ablaze. Curiously, the fire hadn't consumed the room. It had only charred Sir Harry's body and the mattress beneath him. Most chillingly, the killer had sliced open a pillow and scattered white feathers all over the cooling, sticky remains of the billionaire. The wind from the open window had blown these feathers around the room, making the scene look like a grotesque, snowy nightmare. The news of the murder hit the island like a physical blow. This wasn't just a crime. It was an assault on the very foundations of the colony's stability. The governor of the Bahamas at the time was none other than the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII of England, who had abdicated the throne to Mary Wallace Simpson. The Duke and Oakes were close friends, and the Duke's reaction to the murder was immediate and, in hindsight, incredibly suspicious. Rather than allowing the local Bahamian police to handle the investigation, the Duke personally intervened. He declared the murder a matter of national security and, within hours, had placed a call to 2 detectives he knew in Miami, Captain Edward Melchin and Captain James Barker. The Duke's reasoning was that the local police lacked the sophisticated forensic equipment needed to solve such a high-profile crime. However, by bypassing the local authorities and bringing in outside help from Florida, the Duke effectively contaminated the investigation from the start. Melchin and Barker arrived in Nassau that afternoon, but they weren't the elite investigators the Duke made them out to be. Barker, in particular, was later revealed to be deeply compromised, struggling with personal issues and a reputation for finding evidence where none existed. From the moment the Miami detectives stepped into Westbourne, they seemed to have a target in mind. They didn't look at Harold Christie, the man who was in the house at the time of the murder. They didn't look at the disgruntled workers Oakes had recently sparred with. Instead, they set their sights on Count Alfred de Marigny. De Marigny was Sir Harry's son-in-law, having eloped with Harry's eldest daughter, Nancy, when she was only 18. Harry loathed de Marigny. He saw him as a penniless, playboy fortune hunter who had seduced his daughter for the Oakes millions. The two men had a famously explosive relationship, and de Marigny was known for his arrogance and his disdain for the stiff-necked British establishment in Nassau. The case against de Marigny was built almost entirely on a single piece of evidence, a fingerprint. Barker claimed to have found de Marigny's print on a screen near Sir Harry's bed. However, the way the print was handled was a textbook example of forensic malpractice. Barker claimed he had lifted the print but had failed to photograph it in situ on the actual screen before removing it. To make matters worse, de Marigny had a rock-solid alibi for the night of the murder. He had been hosting a dinner party of his own, and several witnesses testified that he never left his guests. Furthermore, the detectives claimed de Marigny had scorched hairs on his arms, suggesting he had been the one to light the fire. De Marigny countered that he had been singed while lighting a spirit lamp at his party. The trial of Alfred de Marigny was the trial of the century for the Caribbean. It was a spectacle of wealth, jealousy, and colonial tension. The prosecution painted de Marigny as a predatory Frenchman who killed his father-in-law in a fit of rage to secure his wife's inheritance. But the defense, led by the brilliant Godfrey Higgs, began to pull the thread of the prosecution's case until it completely unraveled. Higgs focused on the Miami detectives. He forced Barker to admit under oath that he had no photographic proof of where the fingerprint came from. In a stunning courtroom demonstration, Higgs showed how easy it would have been for Barker to lift a print from a glass de Marigny had used during his interrogation and plant it on a slide, claiming it came from the crime scene. As the trial progressed, the focus shifted away from de Marigny's guilt and toward the incompetence, or perhaps the corruption, of the investigation. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a verdict: not guilty. De Marigny was acquitted, though the British authorities immediately deported him from the island, branding him an undesirable. The murder of Sir Harry Oakes was officially back to square one, but the cloud of suspicion had moved. If de Marigny didn't do it, who did? And why was the Duke of Windsor so desperate to frame him? This is where the story shifts from a simple murder mystery into a labyrinth of international conspiracy. In the years following the trial, investigators and historians began to look at the figures who were ignored in 1943. First, there was Harold Christie. Christie was the only other person in the house that night. He claimed he heard nothing, despite the fact that Sir Harry had been brutally beaten and a fire had been set just down the hall. Even more damning, a local boat captain later testified that he saw Harold Christie in a car in downtown Nassau in the middle of the night, at a time when Christie claimed to be asleep at Westbourne. Why would Christie lie? And why was he seen out during the storm? One theory suggests the motive wasn't personal, but financial. The Bahamas was on the verge of a massive transformation. There were plans to bring large-scale gambling and casinos to the islands, a move that Sir Harry Oakes vehemently opposed. Oakes was old school. He didn't want the wrong element ruining his tropical retreat. However, the Duke of Windsor and Harold Christie were both in favor of the development. More importantly, the American Mafia, led by Meyer Lansky, was looking for a new foothold in the Caribbean. Lansky was a man who didn't take no for an answer. Some believe that Oakes was murdered by professional hitmen sent from the mainland, possibly from Miami, to clear the way for the mob's entry into Nassau. This would explain the use of a specialized tool and the attempted burning of the body to destroy evidence. Then there is the Duke of Windsor himself. The Duke's tenure as governor was marked by rumors of pro-Nazi sympathies and a desperate need for money. He was constantly looking for ways to supplement his income, and the development of the Bahamas provided plenty of opportunities for under-the-table deals. If Oakes was an obstacle to those deals, the Duke would have had a motive to see him gone. Furthermore, the Duke's interference in the investigation, bringing in detectives he could control and pushing for a quick conviction of de Marigny, smells of a cover-up. Was the Duke protecting Christie? Was he protecting the mob? Or was he protecting himself? The ritualistic nature of the crime scene remains the most baffling element. The feathers. Some have suggested this was a calling card or a death mask, meant to humiliate Oakes even in death. Others believe it was an attempt to make the murder look like a local crime, perhaps invoking obeah, a folk religion practiced in the Caribbean, to lead the police away from the wealthy elite and toward the island's black population. If that was the plan, it failed, as the sheer brutality and the high profile of the victim made it impossible for the world to look away. In the decades since, Westbourne was eventually torn down, and the site is now part of a luxury resort complex. The bloodstains are gone, but the questions remain. Sir Harry Oakes' daughter, Nancy, spent the rest of her life and much of her fortune trying to find her father's killer, but she died without an answer. Alfred de Marigny moved to Jamaica and then to Cuba, forever haunted by the shadow of the trial. Harold Christie went on to become even wealthier, eventually being knighted himself, taking his secrets to his grave in 1973. Next story, The Vampire of Nuremberg. Nuremberg, Germany, 1972. Nuremberg is a city that carries the heavy weight of history in every stone of its medieval walls and every shadow of its reconstructed Gothic spires. By the early 1970s, the city had largely moved past the scars of the mid-century. transforming into a bustling hub of Bavarian industry and culture. But in the spring of 1972, a different kind of darkness began to seep into the cobblestone streets. A darkness that felt ancient, irrational, and deeply predatory. It was a terror that didn't just take lives, but seemed to feast upon them, leading the public to whisper a name that felt like it belonged to a folk horror tale rather than a modern police file. The Vampire of Nuremberg. The nightmare truly began on the night of May 4th. The air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming linden trees and the damp earth of the surrounding forests. On the outskirts of the city, in a secluded area near the Volsnerweiher, a popular spot for locals to seek a bit of quiet, a young couple sat in their parked car. Bernd and Hannelore were like any other young people of the era, looking for a moment of privacy away from the prying eyes of their families. They were parked in a small Opel, the windows beginning to fog in the evening chill, unaware that they were being watched from the thickets. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. There was no warning, no demand for money, no shouted threats. Just the sudden, sharp cracks of a small-caliber pistol shattering the glass and the silence. The assailant fired multiple times through the window, striking both Bernd and Hannelore with lethal precision. As the life drained from the couple, the attacker didn't flee. He didn't reach for a wallet or a purse. Instead, he opened the car door and began a ritual that would haunt the investigators who arrived on the scene the following morning. When the police discovered the Opel, they were prepared for a tragic scene of a robbery gone wrong. What they found instead was a tableau of inexplicable cruelty. Bernd and Hannelore had been moved, their bodies positioned in a way that suggested the killer had spent significant time with them after their deaths. But the most disturbing detail was the blood. There was a significant amount missing from the scene, not soaked into the upholstery, but seemingly drained. Upon closer inspection, the medical examiner found wounds that weren't caused by the bullets. These were marks that indicated the killer had physically interacted with the victims' bodies in a way that suggested consumption. The city of Nuremberg was instantly plunged into a state of high alert. The Love Lane murders, as the press initially called them, sent a wave of panic through the youth of the city. Patrols were doubled, and warnings were issued for people to avoid secluded parks and forest roads after dark. Yet, the police were at a total loss. There was no clear motive. The victims had no known enemies, and nothing of value had been taken. Ballistics confirmed the weapon was a 6.35mm pistol, a common enough caliber, but the forensics on the scene suggested something far more specialized and sinister. The lead investigators began to look into the occult. It was a time when interest in the fringes of the supernatural was seeing a bizarre resurgence in certain subcultures. But this felt different. This wasn't a group. It felt like the work of a lone, deeply disturbed individual. They began checking records for any known grave robbers or individuals with a history of disturbing behavior in cemeteries. Little did they know, their suspect was a man who had spent a lifetime feeling invisible and who believed he had finally found a way to become powerful. Kuno Hoffman was a man who lived on the extreme margins of society. Born in 1944, he had grown up in the shadow of a destroyed Germany. He was partially deaf and had a significant speech impediment, factors that led to him being relentlessly bullied and isolated throughout his childhood and early adulthood. To the people of Nuremberg, he was a ghost, a laborer who kept his head down, lived in a cramped, cluttered apartment, and spoke to no one. But inside the silence of Hoffman's world, a dangerous fantasy was blooming. Hoffman had become obsessed with the idea of vitality. He felt weak, diminished by his disabilities and his social standing. He began to devour books on black magic and the occult, specifically looking for ways to cure his ailments and gain a sense of dominance over those who looked down on him. He became convinced that the secret to strength and eternal youth lay in the essence of life itself, blood. It started with small animals, but the results, in his mind, were insufficient. He began to frequent cemeteries, digging up fresh graves to perform rituals, but even the dead could not provide the potency he craved. He decided he needed the blood of the living. For weeks after the May murders, Hoffman laid low, but the urge was growing. He spent his nights wandering the city, often ending up in the Westfriedhof, one of Nuremberg's largest cemeteries. It was here that he felt most at home, surrounded by the quiet of the departed. However, the police had also focused their attention on the city's graveyards, suspecting that the killer might return to the places that fueled his macabre interest. In mid-May, a security guard at the Westfriedhof noticed something strange. A figure was moving between the tombstones long after the gates had been locked. The guard didn't approach, instead calling the police. When officers arrived, they found signs of a disturbed grave, but the intruder had vanished into the night like a specter. The police realized they were dealing with someone who knew the terrain of the dead better than the living did. They set a trap, placing plainclothes officers in several cemeteries across the city, waiting for the shadow to return. The breakthrough came not from a cemetery, but from another attempted attack. On a late night in June, Hoffman targeted another couple parked in a secluded area. He approached with his pistol, ready to repeat the horror of the Volksnerwehr. But this time, the driver was faster. As Hoffman raised his weapon, the driver slammed the car into gear and floored it, the vehicle lurching forward and clipping the gunman. Hoffman was thrown to the ground, dropping his pistol and a bag he was carrying. He scrambled into the brush and disappeared before the shaken couple could even process what had happened. When the police recovered the dropped bag, they found a kit that confirmed their worst fears. It contained surgical tools, a flashlight with a red filter to preserve night vision, and notebook. The notebook was a descent into madness. It contained sketches, occult symbols, and rambling manifestos about the purity of the red stream. More importantly, the pistol left behind was a ballistics match for the bullets that had killed Bernd and Hannelore. They finally had their man's tools. Now, they just needed his name. The investigation pivoted to a massive door-to-door inquiry in the neighborhoods surrounding the parks and cemeteries. They looked for men who lived alone, who had a history of hearing issues, and who perhaps smelled of the chemicals used in occult rituals or the earth of a graveyard. It was a painstaking process of elimination. Eventually, a tip led them to a small apartment building where a tenant described a strange, quiet man who often came home in the early morning hours covered in mud. When the police raided Kuno Hoffman's apartment, they weren't prepared for the sheer volume of his obsession. The walls were lined with books on the dark arts. There were jars of unidentifiable substances and more surgical equipment. But the most damning evidence was the clothing, the mud-stained trousers and the jacket that still bore the microscopic spray of Bernd and Hannelore's blood. Hoffman was arrested without a struggle. In fact, he seemed almost relieved, as if the burden of his work had finally become too heavy to carry alone. The interrogation of Kuno Hoffman remains one of the most chilling chapters in German criminal history. Because of his hearing and speech impediments, the process was slow and required a specialized interpreter. But once Hoffman started talking, the details he provided were horrifying. He spoke with a cold, detached logic. He explained that he didn't hate his victims. He viewed them as donors for his survival. He believed that by consuming the blood of the young and healthy, he could fix his hearing, clear his speech, and become a Superman who would no longer be laughed at. He confessed to the murders of Bernd and Hannelore, describing the act not as a crime of passion, but as a harvest. He admitted to drinking from the wounds he inflicted, believing he could feel the vitality of the young couple flowing into him. He also confessed to numerous counts of disturbing the peace of the dead, admitting he had opened over a dozen coffins in the months leading up to the murders. He described the disappointments of the cemetery, how the blood of the deceased was thin and bitter, and how it lacked the spark he needed. The trial, which took place in 1973, was a media sensation, though the public was kept at a distance from the more graphic details to prevent a mass panic. The defense argued that Hoffman was suffering from severe mental illness, pointing to his isolated upbringing and his delusions regarding the occult. They claimed he was unfit to understand the morality of his actions. However, the prosecution presented a different view, that of a calculated, methodical predator. They pointed to his hunting kit, his use of a red-filtered flashlight to avoid detection, and his choice of a small-caliber weapon to ensure he could get close to his victims without causing immediate, messy trauma that would waste the life force he sought. The psychological evaluations of Hoffman revealed a man who had completely retreated into a world of his own making. He didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a scientist of the forbidden. He told the court that he felt stronger after the murders, and that for a brief moment, he believed his hearing had actually improved. It was a chilling testament to the power of a deluded mind to reshape reality to fit its darkest desires. In the end, the court found Kuno Hoffman guilty of 2 counts of murder and multiple counts of desecrating graves. Despite the defense's pleas of insanity, the judges ruled that while he was certainly disturbed, he had demonstrated a high level of planning and an awareness that his actions were illegal, given his efforts to hide his identity and evade the police. He was sentenced to life in prison. The case of the vampire of Nuremberg left a lasting scar on the city. It shattered the sense of post-war security that had been carefully built over 3 decades. It reminded people that even in a modern, industrial society, the most primitive and ancient fears could still find a place to take root. The Walsnerweiher, once a place of romance and quiet reflection, remained a site of unease for years, with locals often glancing over their shoulders at the sound of a snapping twig or a rustle in the dark. Kuno Hoffman spent the rest of his life behind bars, a man who sought to become a god of his own dark myth, but ended up as a cautionary tale of isolation and the dangers of a mind left to rot in its own silence. He died in custody, never having achieved the vitality he murdered for. The vampire was, in the end, just a broken man who had allowed his resentment and his fantasies to turn him into something truly monstrous. Next story, the torso in the tank. Woodhouse, Wales, 1945. In the final, weary months of the Second World War, the rolling landscape of Monmouthshire, Wales, was a place of quiet industry and rural routine. The village of Woodhouse was no exception. Here, life moved at a pace dictated by the seasons and the demands of local farming. But on a crisp morning in May 1945, this pastoral peace was shattered by a discovery so grisly and so inexplicable that it would occupy the minds of Scotland Yard's finest for months to come. It is a story of a missing person, a calculated deception, and a victim whose identity remained a cipher long after his remains were found. The scene of the discovery was a secluded farm owned by a man named William Williams. On the property sat a large, disused stone water tank, partially sunken into the earth and covered by heavy slabs. It hadn't been used for years, or so the neighbors thought, when a farmhand decided to clear the tank, expecting nothing more than stagnant water and silt. He instead found a heavy, sodden sack tied with thick twine. As the sack was hauled to the surface and the canvas gave way, the true nature of its contents became clear. It wasn't livestock or refuse. It was the torso of a human being. The local constabulary was immediately overwhelmed. In an era before DNA, profiling, and digital databases, identifying a body, especially one missing its head, arms, and legs, was an almost impossible task. The torso was wrapped in a piece of distinctive floral-patterned linoleum, a detail that suggested the killer had taken the time to package the remains within a household setting. The local police knew they were out of their depth, and a call was placed to London. The murder squad of Scotland Yard was dispatched, led by the legendary Chief Inspector Robert Fabian, known to the public as Fabian of the Yard. Fabian arrived in Wales with a reputation for meticulousness. He looked at the torso and saw not just a victim, but a puzzle of biological clues. The body had been expertly dismembered, suggesting the killer had some knowledge of anatomy, perhaps a butcher or someone accustomed to dressing game. But the most pressing question was the who. Who was this man, and how did he end up in a forgotten tank in the Welsh countryside? The search for the missing limbs and head began in earnest. Divers scoured nearby ponds, and dozens of volunteers poked through the dense undergrowth of the surrounding woods. But the rest of the man was nowhere to be found. Without a face or fingerprints, Fabian had to rely on the only thing he had, the torso itself. A forensic pathologist examined the remains and noted a crucial detail. The victim had been a middle-aged man, likely in his 50s. There was a distinct surgical scar on the abdomen, a remnant of a past operation. This was the first real thread Fabian could pull. He began a grueling search through hospital records across Wales and the west of England, looking for men of a certain age who had undergone that specific surgery and who had recently dropped off the radar. While the forensic search continued, Fabian turned his attention to the residents of Woodhouse. He became particularly interested in a man named Peter Thomas. Thomas was a local character, a man who lived somewhat on the fringes of the community. He was known to be a bit of a wanderer, but he hadn't been seen in months. When Fabian visited Thomas's small cottage, he found it seemingly abandoned, yet strangely preserved. Neighbors told a conflicting story. They said Peter Thomas had moved away to find work in a munitions factory or perhaps to live with relatives in the north. But as Fabian dug deeper, the timeline didn't fit. Thomas was a man of habit. He didn't just disappear without settling his affairs. And then there was the matter of his pension. In the mid-1940s, the post-war bureaucracy was strict. Fabian discovered that someone had been continuing to collect Peter Thomas's pension long after he had vanished from the village. This wasn't a case of a man starting a new life. It was a case of someone stepping into a dead man's shoes. The investigation pivoted toward a local farm laborer named William Glenn. Glenn was a man known for his strength and his somewhat volatile temper. He had been a close associate of Peter Thomas. Some said he was the only person Thomas truly trusted. When Fabian interviewed Glenn, he found a man who was almost too helpful. Glenn claimed that Thomas had simply left one night, handing over his keys and asking Glenn to look after his things. Fabian wasn't buying it. He returned to the cottage where Thomas had lived and began a forensic sweep that was revolutionary for the time. Under the floorboards, he found something that chilled him: scraps of the same floral linoleum that had been used to wrap the torso in the tank. The connection was now physical. The victim in the tank was almost certainly Peter Thomas, and the cottage was the site of his final moments. But a motive was still missing. Why would Glenn, a man with a steady job and a place in the community, kill an elderly neighbor for a meager pension? Fabian began to look into Glenn's finances. It turned out that Glenn was a man of hidden debts and desperate needs. He had been living far beyond his means, and Peter Thomas, despite his outward appearance of poverty, was rumored to have a small hoard of cash hidden away, savings from a lifetime of frugal living. The reconstruction of the crime began to take shape in Fabian's mind. He theorized that Glenn had gone to Thomas's cottage, perhaps under the guise of friendship or a request for a loan. When Thomas refused, or perhaps when Glenn simply decided it was easier to take what he wanted, a struggle ensued. The physical evidence in the cottage, the scrubbed floors, the missing rugs, suggested a violent encounter followed by a panicked cleanup. The most harrowing part of the case was the disposal. The dismemberment hadn't been an act of ritual. It was an act of cold, hard logistics. Glenn needed to transport the body away from the cottage, and a full-grown man is heavy and conspicuous. By reducing the body to parts, he could carry it in sacks, bit by bit, to the distant water tank on the Williams farm, a place he knew would be ignored. Fabian confronted Glenn with the evidence of the linoleum and the pension fraud. Glenn's composure began to crack. He couldn't explain how the flooring from the cottage ended up in a death shroud at the bottom of a tank. He couldn't explain why he was signing Thomas's name at the post office. The trial that followed was a sensation. It was one of the first major cases of the post-war era, and the public was captivated by the image of the torso in the tank. The prosecution painted a picture of a predatory man who had exploited the vulnerability of an elderly neighbor, turning a quiet Welsh village into a scene of carnage. Glenn's defense was weak. They argued that the torso couldn't be definitively proven to be Peter Thomas. After all, the head was missing. How could the jury be sure? But Fabian's work with the surgical scar and the matching linoleum proved to be insurmountable. The medical records of Peter Thomas perfectly matched the pathology of the remains found in the tank. The headless victim had been given back his identity through the sheer persistence of the investigation. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. William Glenn was found guilty of the murder of Peter Thomas. The motive was confirmed as greed, a few pounds of pension money and whatever meager savings Thomas had kept in his home. It was a brutal, senseless end for a man who had harmed no one. The case of the torso in the tank remains a landmark in British forensic history. It demonstrated the power of the small things: a scrap of linoleum, a surgical record, the timing of a pension payment. For Robert Fabian, it solidified his status as the premier detective of his age. He had taken a nameless, faceless fragment of a human being and woven a narrative of justice that resonated across the country. But for the village of Woodhouse, the shadow of 1945 lingered long after the gallows had claimed William Glenn. The old stone tank was eventually filled in, and the farm moved on to new owners. Yet the story stayed. It served as a grim reminder that even in the most peaceful corners of the world, human darkness can take root. Peter Thomas was eventually laid to rest, his name restored to him, no longer just a torso in a tank, but a man who was missed and whose life was finally accounted for. The legacy of the case also highlights the transition in criminal investigation. We see the shift from traditional boots on the ground policing to a more scientific, analytical approach. Fabian didn't just look for witnesses, he looked for patterns. He understood that a killer might be able to hide a body, but they can rarely hide their own habits or the physical traces of their environment. In the decades since, forensic science has advanced to levels Fabian could only dream of. Today, a single hair or a drop of fluid would have identified Thomas within hours. But in 1945, it was about the grind. It was about a detective walking miles of country roads, talking to shopkeepers about the patterns on their floor coverings, and sitting in dusty hospital archives. The murder of Peter Thomas is often overshadowed by the more famous London Rippers or the high-profile gangland killings of the era. However, it stands as a perfect example of the quiet horror of domestic crime. It wasn't a monster from the city who took Thomas's life. It was a man he knew, a man who lived just down the lane. It was a betrayal of community and a chilling display of how easily a life can be reduced to a problem to be disposed of. Next story, the murder of Muriel McKay. Wimbledon, London, 1969. On the evening of December 29, 1969, the air in Wimbledon was biting, the kind of damp cold that settles into your bones. Alec McKay, the deputy chairman of News Limited and a right-hand man to a young, rising media mogul named Rupert Murdoch, pulled his car into the driveway of his home on Arthur Road. It was roughly 7:45 p.m. Alec was looking forward to a quiet evening with his wife, Muriel. They had been married for decades, and at 55, Muriel was the heart of their home. Warm, deeply loved, and a constant presence in the fast-paced world Alec inhabited. But when Alec walked through the front door, he wasn't met with the usual greeting or the smell of dinner. Instead, he found a silence so heavy it felt physical. The lights were on. The television was blaring in the lounge, broadcasting to an empty room. As Alec moved through the house, the sense of unease sharpened into a cold dread. In the hallway, the telephone had been ripped from the wall, its wires dangling like severed veins. In the kitchen, the scene was even more jarring. A bottle of milk sat on the counter, and a dinner of chops and vegetables had been prepared but left untouched on the stove. Then, he saw the items scattered on the floor. Muriel's handbag was there, its contents spilled. Nearby lay a bundle of twine, a rusty billhook, and a roll of adhesive tape. But of Muriel, there was no sign. There was no blood, no evidence of a struggle beyond the misplaced objects, and yet she was gone. It was as if she had simply evaporated from the safety of her own home. Alec called the police from a neighbor's house, and within hours, the McKay residence was swarming with Scotland Yard detectives. Initially, there was confusion. Why Muriel? Alec was wealthy, yes, but he wasn't the owner of the empire. Then, the first piece of the puzzle clicked into place, though it only made the situation more surreal. Rupert Murdoch had recently purchased the News of the World, and for a brief period, he had lent his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce to Alec while his own car was being serviced. The kidnappers, it seemed, had been following that car. They hadn't wanted Muriel McKay. They had wanted Anna Murdoch, Rupert's young wife. In a tragic twist of mistaken identity, Muriel had been taken because she lived in the shadow of a much bigger target. The following day, the phone rang. A man with a deep, distorted voice, calling himself M3, spoke to Alec. The demands were staggering. £1 million for Muriel's safe return. In 1969, this was an astronomical sum, one of the first major ransom demands in British history. The caller was cold, clinical, and warned Alec that any involvement with the police would lead to Muriel's death. What followed was a harrowing cat-and-mouse game that played out across the bleak landscapes of wintertime England. The kidnappers began sending letters, some containing snippets of Muriel's clothing or handwritten notes from her, pleading for her life. "Please do what they ask," she wrote in one, her handwriting shaky but recognizable. "I'm cold and I want to come home." These letters didn't come from London. They were postmarked from various locations in North London and Hertfordshire, suggesting the captors were mobile and organized. Scotland Yard, led by the legendary Detective Chief Superintendent Bill Sutherland, set up a sophisticated sting operation. They had Alec engage in long, drawn-out negotiations to keep the kidnappers on the line while they tried to trace the calls. A monumental task in the era of manual exchanges. The kidnappers were tech-savvy for the time, using stolen cars and public phone booths, always staying one step ahead. The tension peaked when the kidnappers gave instructions for a money drop. Alec was told to drive to a specific location in Totteridge, carrying suitcases filled with what the kidnappers thought was £1 million, but was actually bundles of scrap paper topped with real notes. Undercover officers were positioned everywhere, in trees, behind hedges, and in unmarked vans. But the kidnappers were paranoid. They spotted a police presence and aborted the mission, disappearing into the night. The investigation took a turn when a police officer, patrolling the outskirts of Stockingpelham in Hertfordshire, noticed a dark Volvo parked near a phone box. The officer noted the registration number. Later, that same car was seen near another phone booth used to make a ransom call. The vehicle was traced to a run-down, isolated property known as Rooks Farm. Rooks Farm was a bleak, muddy plot of land owned by two brothers, Arthur and Nizamuddin Hossain. They had moved to the UK from Trinidad and were struggling to make a success of the farm. Arthur was the older brother, charismatic and dominant, while Nizamuddin was more reserved, often following his brother's lead. When police began surveillance on the farm, they noticed something peculiar. The brothers were acting strangely, burning large amounts of debris and seemingly on edge. On February 7, 1970, police raided Rooks Farm. The scene was grim. The house was filthy, and the brothers were defiant. As forensic teams combed through the property, they found the smoking gun, or rather, the smoking twine. In the house, they found a roll of twine that perfectly matched the piece left at the McKay home on the night of the abduction. They also found a newspaper with Muriel's fingerprints on it, and a notebook containing drafts of the ransom letters. However, there was one thing missing: Muriel. The brothers were arrested and charged with murder despite the absence of a body, a rarity in British legal history at the time. The trial was a media sensation. The prosecution argued that the brothers had botched the kidnapping from the start. They hadn't realized who Muriel was until they got her back to the farm, and when the ransom negotiations stalled and the police heat intensified, they had panicked. The details that emerged during the trial and subsequent investigations were haunting. It was believed Muriel had been kept in a cold, unheated room in the farmhouse. The brothers, desperate to hide their crime, were alleged to have disposed of her remains in the most horrific way possible, by feeding her to the farm's pigs. This theory, while never fully proven in court, became the enduring, grisly legend of the case. The brothers never confessed to the location of her body, maintaining a wall of silence that would last for decades. Arthur and Nizamuddin Hossain were convicted of murder and kidnapping. Arthur was sentenced to life imprisonment, and Nizamuddin received a shorter sentence for his role. Arthur died in prison in 2009, never uttering a word about Muriel's final moments. Nizamuddin, however, was eventually released and deported back to Trinidad. For the McKay family, the conviction brought no closure. Alec McKay died without ever knowing where his wife was laid to rest. The mystery of Muriel's whereabouts became a hollow ache that passed down through the generations. Her children, Diane and Ian, spent decades searching for answers, fueled by the hope that one day they could give their mother a proper burial. In recent years, the case saw an unexpected resurgence. Nizamuddin Hossain, now an elderly man living in poverty in Trinidad, began to speak. In interviews with documentary filmmakers and the McKay family's legal representatives, he claimed he wanted to clear his conscience. He admitted to the kidnapping, but offered a different version of her death. He claimed Muriel had died of a heart attack shortly after being taken, brought on by the sheer terror of the ordeal. He alleged that they had buried her on the farm, near a specific fence line, rather than the horrific pig theory that had dominated the headlines. This sparked a renewed effort to find her. In 2022 and again in 2024, police returned to Rook's farm with ground-penetrating radar and excavation teams. The McKay children stood by the muddy fields, watching as the earth was peeled back, hoping for a fragment of bone or a piece of jewelry. They even met with Nizamuddin via video link, pleading with him to be precise. "Please, just tell us where she is," Diane begged. Nizamuddin pointed to a spot on a map, insisting that was where they had laid her. But the farm had changed over 50 years. Hedges had been removed, buildings added, and the landscape altered by decades of farming. Despite extensive digging in the areas Nizamuddin identified, Muriel remained hidden. The search was eventually called off, leaving the family in the same agonizing limbo they had inhabited since 1969. Next story, the murder of PC Nathaniel Edgar. Southgate, London, 1948. The winter of 1948 was a somber time for London. The city was still nursing the deep, jagged scars of the Second World War, a landscape of bomb sites and ration books where the victory bells had long since faded into the grueling reality of post-war austerity. In the North London suburb of Southgate, the streets were usually quiet, a sanctuary of semi-detached houses and neat gardens that felt worlds away from the grime and desperation of the East End. But on the night of February 13th, that suburban silence was shattered by 3 sharp cracks of gunfire that would not only claim the life of a dedicated public servant, but would also spark a national debate that reached the highest halls of British power. Police Constable Nathaniel Edgar was 33 years old, a man who personified the steady, unassuming courage of the Metropolitan Police. A veteran of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, he had survived the horrors of the war only to return home to a different kind of frontline. He was a husband and a father to 2 young sons, a man who spent his days patrolling the streets he called home. By early 1948, the police were dealing with a surge in crime. The spivs and deserters who haunted the shadows of the post-war world were becoming increasingly emboldened, fueled by a thriving black market and a desperate need for quick cash. Southgate had been plagued by a series of opportunistic burglaries, and Nathaniel Edgar was part of a plainclothes detail assigned to catch the phantom prowlers who were haunting the residential avenues. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that Friday evening, Edgar donned his civilian coat, a humble disguise intended to let him blend into the twilight. He wasn't carrying a firearm. British police officers didn't then, and rarely do now. His only tools were his training, his whistle, and a small, leather-bound pocketbook. He kissed his wife, Rita, goodbye, promising to be home for tea, and stepped out into the biting February air. Around 7:30 p.m., Edgar was patrolling Broad Walk, a long, respectable stretch of road lined with trees and substantial homes. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and a stranger stood out. He noticed a man loitering near the entrance to a garage, his collar turned up against the wind. The man looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the shadows every time a car passed. Edgar, drawing on his years of experience, decided to intervene. He approached the individual, identified himself as a police officer, and asked for the man's identity card, a mandatory document in those post-war years. What happened next occurred in a blurred sequence of violent motion. The man reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out an ID card. He pulled out a Luger, a German-made pistol, likely brought back as a trophy from the war. Before Edgar could even raise his hands, the stranger fired. The first bullet struck Edgar in the groin. The second hit him in the thigh. As Edgar collapsed to the pavement, The gunman stood over him and fired a third time, the bullet tearing through Edgar's chest and lungs. The assailant then turned and vanished into the darkness of a nearby park, leaving the officer bleeding out on the cold concrete. The sound of the shots brought neighbors running. Among them was a local doctor who lived just doors away. They found Nathaniel Edgar slumped against a brick wall, his face pale and his breathing ragged. Even as his life force ebbed away, Edgar's training and his sense of duty remained remarkably intact. He knew he was dying. He knew the man who had shot him was still out there. In an act of sheer, agonizing willpower, Edgar whispered to the neighbors and the arriving uniformed officers. He didn't ask for a priest or complain of the pain. Instead, he pointed toward his pocket. Inside that pocket was his notebook. Before the third shot had even been fired, or perhaps in the seconds immediately following the initial confrontation, Edgar had managed to perform a final, heroic act of police work. He had seen the man's identity card. He had memorized the details. And as he lay there, he told the officers that he had written the name and address of his killer on a page in his book just moments before the violence erupted. The name he had recorded was Donald George Thomas. Nathaniel Edgar was rushed to the North Middlesex Hospital, but the damage was too extensive. He passed away on the operating table, leaving a grieving family and a police force galvanized by a sense of righteous fury. The hunt for Donald George Thomas began immediately. Donald George Thomas was exactly the kind of man the police feared most in the late 1940s. He was a 22-year-old Army deserter, a man who had cast off the discipline of the military to live a life of petty crime and evasion. He was a drifter, a man with no fixed loyalty and a stolen Luger in his waistband. The name Edgar had captured was real, but Thomas had already fled his known address. The Metropolitan Police launched one of the most intensive manhunts in their history. Every boarding house, every cheap hotel, and every known haunt for deserters was turned upside down. The investigation led detectives to a boarding house in Clapham, South London. Through painstaking door-to-door inquiries and the cultivation of informants in the criminal underworld, they learned that a man matching Thomas's description had recently taken a room there. On February 17th, just 4 days after the murder, a team of detectives led by Chief Superintendent Barrett descended on the property. They knew Thomas was armed and had already proven he was willing to kill a police officer to avoid capture. The raid was a masterpiece of tension. Officers surrounded the building, blocking every exit. They moved through the hallways with a quiet, lethal efficiency. When they reached the door of the room Thomas was suspected to be in, they didn't knock. They burst inside. Thomas was caught completely off guard, lying on his bed. He reached for the Luger hidden under his pillow, but the detectives were faster. They tackled him, pinning his arms and wresting the weapon from his grip. In his pockets, they found the very identity card that Nathaniel Edgar had inspected in his final moments. The arrest of Donald George Thomas was a victory for the Met, but the case was far from over. It moved from the streets of London to the hallowed halls of the Old Bailey, and its timing could not have been more politically charged. In 1948, the British Parliament was embroiled in a fierce, emotional debate over the Criminal Justice Bill. A central pillar of this debate was the proposed abolition of the death penalty. For years, reformers had argued that capital punishment was a barbaric relic of the past, while traditionalists argued it was a necessary deterrent against the rising tide of post-war violent crime. The murder of PC Nathaniel Edgar became the focal point of this national conversation. To the public, Edgar was a martyr, a brave officer who had used his dying breath to ensure justice was served. To the supporters of the death penalty, Thomas was the ultimate argument for the gallows. He was a deserter who had killed a defenseless officer with a weapon of war. If anyone deserved the long drop, it was he. Thomas's trial began in May 1948. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The dying testimony of Nathaniel Edgar, captured in that blood-stained notebook, was a piece of evidence so powerful it was almost impossible to refute. The prosecution presented the Luger, ballistically matched to the bullets recovered from Edgar's body in the scene. Witnesses testified to seeing a man of Thomas's build fleeing the area. Thomas, for his part, tried to claim the gun went off accidentally during a struggle, but the three distinct wounds, delivered at different angles, made that story ring hollow. The jury took very little time to reach their verdict. Donald George Thomas was found guilty of murder. In accordance with the law at the time, the judge donned the black cap and sentenced him to death by hanging. However, the story took a turn that would shock the British public. While Thomas sat in the condemned cell at Pentonville Prison, the House of Commons had passed a clause in the Criminal Justice Bill that would suspend the death penalty for 5 years. Although the House of Lords later rejected this clause, the Home Secretary, James Shuter Eade, found himself in a difficult legal and moral position. Because the Commons had signaled its intent to abolish the penalty, he decided to exercise the royal prerogative of mercy for every prisoner sentenced to death during this period of legislative flux. To the outrage of the police and much of the public, Donald George Thomas was granted a reprieve. His death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. The man who had gunned down a hero in a Southgate Street would not face the executioner. This decision sent shockwaves through the country and played a significant role in the eventual defeat of the abolitionist clause in the House of Lords that year. The death penalty would remain on the books in Britain for another 16 years, partly because the ghost of Nathaniel Edgar weighed so heavily on the conscience of the nation. But the story of Donald George Thomas didn't end with his life sentence. He was a man who seemed to have a fundamental disdain for authority and the walls intended to hold him. In 1952, while serving his time at the high-security Dartmoor prison, Thomas managed to do the unthinkable. Along with another inmate, he staged a daring escape from the Granite Prison on the moors. For several days, the two fugitives led police on a desperate chase across the bleak, mist-shrouded landscape of Devon. The escape reignited the public's memory of the Edgar murder. The fear that a cop killer was back on the loose created a sense of panic in the local villages. However, the harsh conditions of the moors eventually broke the fugitives. They were captured, cold and starving, and returned to their cells. Thomas would eventually serve a significant portion of his life behind bars, but he remained a symbol of the revolving door of justice that many felt had failed Nathaniel Edgar. For the family of Nathaniel Edgar, the legal maneuverings and the escape of his killer were secondary to the immense hole left in their lives. Rita Edgar was left to raise two young boys alone. Her husband's sacrifice honored by the police force, but the void in her home never filled. In the decades that followed, the Metropolitan Police ensured that Edgar's name was never forgotten. A memorial plaque was eventually placed near the spot where he fell on Broad Walk, a permanent reminder to the residents of Southgate of the price of their safety. The case of PC Nathaniel Edgar is often cited in the history of British policing for the dying deposition contained in his notebook. It is a textbook example of presence of mind under extreme duress. But beyond the forensic and legal significance, it remains a deeply human story. It is the story of a man who did his job until the very end, a man who understood that his duty to the law was more important than his own survival. When we look back at the late 1940s, we often see the glamour of the cinema or the grand movements of post-war Reconstruction. But the reality for men like Nathaniel Edgar was found in the cold, dark corners of suburban streets, facing men who had been brutalized by war and felt they had nothing to lose. Edgar didn't have a vest, a radio, or a firearm. He had a notebook and a sense of right and wrong. The debate over the death penalty that his murder fueled would eventually result in its total abolition in the 1960s, a shift in British society toward a different philosophy of justice. But the bravery of the officer who wrote his killer's name while his heart was failing remains a timeless testament to the character of those who walked the thin blue line. Nathaniel Edgar wasn't looking to be a hero that night in February. He was just a man looking to make sure his neighborhood was safe for his children. In doing so, he left behind a legacy that is still studied by every new recruit who dons the uniform of the Metropolitan Police. Today, Broad Walk is still a quiet, tree-lined street. The houses are still neat, the gardens still well-tended. Most people walking their dogs or driving home from work likely don't know that this was the site of a murder that once held the entire country in its grip. But if you look closely, the history is there, etched into the memory of the city and the records of the Old Bailey. It is the story of a life taken too soon, a killer who cheated the gallows, and a notebook that spoke when its owner no longer could. Next story, the Great Pearl Robbery. London, 1913. In the early morning hours of July 16, 1913, a man named Max Mayer sat in his office at 88 Hatton Garden, the heart of London's Diamond District. Mayer was one of the most respected gemstone merchants in the world, a man who dealt in fortunes that most people couldn't imagine in a dozen lifetimes. On his desk sat a small, nondescript package that had just arrived via registered mail from Paris. It was wrapped in heavy brown paper and secured with several distinct blue wax seals. To any casual observer, it looked like a standard shipment of business documents or perhaps a small clock. But to Mayer, it represented the pinnacle of his career. Inside that box was a necklace. It wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was a string of 61 perfectly matched, pink-tinted oriental pearls. These weren't the cultured pearls we see today. They were natural, harvested from the depths of the ocean at great human cost. It had taken years to find 61 pearls of such uniform size, luster, and hue. The necklace was valued at £150,000, a figure that, in today's money, would exceed $18 million. It was arguably the most expensive single piece of jewelry in the world at the time. Mayer reached for a pair of scissors, carefully cutting the twine and breaking the wax seals. He peeled back the paper, expecting to see the plush leather casing of the necklace. Instead, he found something that made his heart stop. Inside the box, nestled in a bed of cotton wool, were 3 lumps of sugar and a few pieces of French coal. The necklace, the fortune he had spent years assembling, was gone. This was the beginning of the Great Pearl Robbery, a crime so audacious and executed with such precision that it would baffle Scotland Yard and captivate the global press. It was a heist that didn't involve masks, guns, or a midnight break-in. It was a crime of intellect, timing, and a deep understanding of the very systems meant to protect the world's wealth. To understand how this happened, we have to look at the man who would eventually be identified as the mastermind, Joseph Grizzard. In the London underworld of the early 20th century, Grizzard was a legend. He didn't look like a criminal. He was a portly, well-dressed man with a refined manner and a penchant for fine cigars. He operated out of a jewelry shop, but his true business was far more lucrative. Grizzard was the king of fences, a man who could move stolen goods better than anyone in Europe. He was also a brilliant tactician. He didn't just sell stolen items. He planned the thefts from the ground up. Grizzard had been watching the Hatton Garden Diamond District for years. He knew the rhythms of the merchants, the schedules of the mail carriers, and the vulnerabilities of the registered post. When word reached him that Max Mayer was importing a necklace of such immense value, Grizzard saw the opportunity of a lifetime. He assembled a crew of specialists: James Lockett, a seasoned thief; Simon Silverman, a man with deep connections in the jewelry trade; and William Liserman, an expert in logistics. The plan they devised was terrifyingly simple. They knew the necklace would be sent from Henri Salomon, a jeweler in Paris, to Mayer in London. They knew it would travel by train and ferry, handled by dozens of postal workers along the way. Somewhere in that chain of custody, there was a window of time where the package would be vulnerable. The thieves didn't try to intercept the package in transit on the high seas or on a moving train. Instead, they focused on the final leg of the journey, the London postal system. They managed to acquire a key to a post box, or, more likely, bribe someone with access to the mail bags. But their true genius lay in the switch. They didn't just steal the box. They replaced it with a near-perfect replica. They had studied the weight of the original package, the type of paper used, and even the specific shade of the wax seals. The sugar and coal were chosen specifically because they matched the exact weight of the pearl necklace to the gram. This ensured that no postal clerk would notice a difference in the package's heft as it moved from hand to hand. When Max Mayer realized he had been robbed, the panic was instantaneous. Scotland Yard dispatched their finest, including Chief Inspector Alfred Ward, a man known for his dogged persistence. Ward knew that a necklace this famous couldn't be sold easily. You don't just walk into a pawn shop with an $18 million necklace. The thieves would have to break it down, selling the pearls individually or in small groups, which would significantly decrease their value. Or they would have to find a very wealthy, very discreet buyer who didn't care about the necklace's history. For several weeks, the trail was cold. Grizzard and his team were ghosts. They knew the police were watching every known fence in London. They stayed quiet, keeping the necklace hidden while the heat died down. But Grizzard had a weakness. He loved the game. He couldn't resist the urge to start looking for a buyer, and he began reaching out to his contacts on the continent. This was the opening Scotland Yard needed. They began working with two diamond dealers who acted as informants, men named Brandstatter and Spanier. These men were instructed to put out the word that they had a buyer, a wealthy Frenchman, who was interested in high-quality pearls. The bait was taken. After several rounds of tense negotiations conducted through intermediaries, a meeting was set at a nondescript tea room in London. The undercover operation was a masterclass in Edwardian espionage. Detectives from Scotland Yard trailed the suspects through the winding streets of the city, using disguises and varying their pace to avoid detection. The pressure began to mount on Grizzard. He was a man who prided himself on being steps ahead of the law, but he could feel the net tightening. He had the necklace, but it was becoming a weight around his neck. The police were everywhere. Every time he turned a corner, he saw a face that looked a little too familiar, a man reading a newspaper who wasn't actually turning the pages. Despite the danger, Grizzard decided to move forward with the sale. He met with the buyers several times, but he was cautious. He would never bring the pearls to the first meeting. He would show one or two as a sample, then disappear into the London fog. The detectives were frustrated. They didn't just want the thieves, they wanted the necklace. If they moved too soon and arrested Grizzard without the pearls, the jewelry might be lost forever, hidden away in some cellar or dropped into the Thames. The climax of the investigation came on September 2nd, 1913. The thieves were meeting the buyers at a subway station, planning to finalize the deal. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Grizzard, Lockett, Silverman, and Liserman were all present. They were suspicious, their eyes constantly darting around the crowded platform. As the signal was given, the undercover officers moved in. It was a swift, silent takedown. The King of Fences and his crew were in handcuffs before they could even reach for a weapon or discard any evidence. But when the police searched the men, they found nothing. No pearls, no necklace. Grizzard smiled at the officers. He knew the law. Without the stolen property, the case against them was significantly weaker. He believed he had won the game. He had hidden the pearls somewhere they would never be found, or so he thought. He assumed that even if he went to prison for a short time for conspiracy, the fortune would be waiting for him when he got out. However, the story of the Great Pearl Robbery was about to take a turn into the truly bizarre. While Grizzard and his men were being processed at the police station, a man named Augustus Horn was walking to work in the North London district of Highbury. Horn was a simple man, a piano tuner by trade, who was just trying to make it through his day. As he walked along the gutter of a quiet street, he spotted a small, dirty package wrapped in newspaper, tied with a bit of string. Thinking it might contain something useful, perhaps some discarded tools, or even just a bit of scrap metal, he picked it up. He opened the newspaper and found a small box. Inside that box, he saw what looked like a string of beads. They were covered in dirt and grime from the street. Horn looked at them and thought they were nothing more than cheap imitation jewelry, the kind of thing a child might wear as part of costume. He almost threw them back into the gutter. Instead, he put them in his pocket. Later that morning, he showed them to a friend at a local pub. He joked that he had found a fortune in the street. His friend looked at the beads and noticed something. Even through the dirt, there was a strange, deep luster to them. He suggested that Horn take them to a jeweler, just in case. Horn walked into a nearby jewelry shop and placed the beads on the counter. The jeweler took one look at them. His face went pale, and he immediately locked the front door. He knew exactly what he was looking at. The imitation jewelry found in a Highbury gutter was the Mayer necklace. It turned out that in the moments before their arrest, the thieves had realized they were being followed. In a moment of desperation, one of them had tossed the necklace into the gutter, hoping to come back for it later, or simply wanting to rid themselves of the incriminating evidence. They had wrapped it in a scrap of newspaper and dropped it as they walked, assuming no one would notice a small piece of trash in the London streets. The news of the recovery hit London like a lightning bolt. The most expensive necklace in the world had been found by a piano tuner in a gutter. Augustus Horn became an overnight celebrity. He was rewarded with a significant sum of money, pound 10,000, which was a life-changing amount for a working-class man in 1913. It was enough to ensure he never had to tune another piano again if he didn't want to. The trial of Joseph Grizzard and his associates was one of the most publicized events of the era. The courtroom was packed every day with socialites, journalists, and curious onlookers. The prosecution laid out the meticulous nature of the theft, showing how the thieves had exploited the postal system and how they had nearly escaped with the crime of the century. Grizzard, ever the showman, seemed to enjoy the attention. He sat in the dock with a smirk, watching as the evidence was presented. He was eventually sentenced to 7 years of penal servitude, while his accomplices received slightly shorter sentences. It was a heavy blow for the king of fences, but many believed he had more secrets hidden away. The pearls themselves were eventually returned to Max Mayer. However, the necklace was never the same. The fame of the robbery made it too recognizable to be worn by any socialite who valued her privacy. The Mayer necklace was eventually broken up. The 61 pearls were sold individually or in smaller clusters. They were scattered across the globe, becoming parts of other necklaces, earrings, and rings. But the legend of the Great Pearl Robbery lived on. It became a cautionary tale for the jewelry trade and a case study for Scotland Yard. It highlighted the transition of crime into the modern era, a time when brains were becoming more valuable than brawn, and when the most secure systems in the world could be undone by 3 lumps of sugar and a few pieces of coal. In the end, the story is a reminder of the strange hand of fate. The most brilliant criminal mind in London had executed the perfect heist, only to have his prize found in the mud by a man who almost threw it away. The pearls that had been sought by kings and millionaires ended up as a pile of beads in a piano tuner's pocket, a final irony in a case that defined an age. Joseph Grizzard died a few years after his release from prison. He never reclaimed his former glory. The London underworld had moved on, and the king of fences was a man of the past. But whenever the story of the great heists is told, his name is always mentioned. He was the man who stole the impossible, only to lose it to the common streets of London. Next story, the Porthcurno Mystery. Cornwall, England, 1936. The rugged coastline of West Cornwall is a place where the land seems to surrender to the Atlantic with a violent, jagged beauty. In the summer of 1936, the village of Porthcurno was, as it is now, a place of stark contrasts. The white sands of the beach looking almost tropical against the dark, granite cliffs that stand as sentinels over the English Channel. It was a place for holiday makers to escape the heat of London, a place of bracing sea air and quiet tea rooms. But on the morning of August 3rd, the tranquility of this coastal haven was shattered by a discovery that would haunt the local community for decades and leave Scotland Yard grappling with one of the most perplexing puzzles of the pre-war. EERIT began with a casual walk. A group of holiday makers were navigating the narrow, winding cliff paths that lead toward Logan Rock, a famous local landmark. The air would have been thick with the scent of salt spray and gorse. As they rounded a bend near a steep gully known as Logan's Well, something caught their eye, something that didn't belong among the gray stones and the hardy coastal grass. Tucked into a deep crevice in the rocks, hidden from the main path, but visible if you leaned just far enough over the edge, lay the body of a woman. She looked almost as if she were sleeping, or perhaps had just sat down to rest and simply never got up. She was dressed elegantly, in a way that suggested she wasn't a local farmhand or a rugged hiker, but someone who had come to the coast for leisure. She wore a green knitted suit, a matching beret, and sensible walking shoes. But as the witnesses drew closer, the illusion of sleep vanished. Her face was bruised, her clothing was slightly disarrayed, and there was a stillness about her that only comes with the finality of death. The local police from Penzance were summoned immediately. In 1936, the arrival of a body on the cliffs was a logistical nightmare. The terrain was treacherous, and the investigation had to be conducted under the gaze of curious onlookers and the unpredictable Cornish weather. When the investigators finally reached the body, they found a scene that raised more questions than answers. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s. She was well-nourished and clearly cared for, yet she carried no identification, no purse, no wallet, no railway ticket. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that the labels had been meticulously removed from almost every piece of her clothing. Her coat, her dress, even her undergarments, the tags that would usually indicate a manufacturer or a shop had been cut away. It was a classic hallmark of someone who did not want to be identified, or perhaps someone who had been handled by a person who wanted to ensure she remained a ghost. An initial examination by the local surgeon revealed the cause of death was not a fall, though her location in the gully might have suggested one. There were signs of manual strangulation and significant blunt force trauma to her head. This was not an accident. It was a cold, calculated act of violence. The quiet cliffs of Porthcurno had become a crime scene, and the victim was a woman without a name. The press immediately dubbed it the Porthcurno Mystery. In the 1930s, the body on the moors or mystery of the cliffs were staples of the sensationalist tabloids. But this case had a particular grip on the public imagination. Who was this woman in the green suit? And why had she come to the very edge of England to die? The first task for the police was to restore her identity. They distributed her description across the country. 5 feet 5 inches tall, dark hair, brown eyes, and a distinctive gold bridge in her dental work. They combed through the guest books of every hotel, boarding house, and bed and breakfast from Land's End to St. Ives. It was a grueling process of elimination. Days passed with no one coming forward to claim her. Then, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a laundry mark. Despite the labels being removed from her clothes, a tiny, handwritten code from a commercial laundry service had been overlooked on the hem of her slip. This small oversight became the thread that the police began to pull. The mark was traced back to a laundry in London, which in turn led them to a flat in the Kensington area. The victim was finally identified as Cecily Batten, a 29-year-old woman who had been living and working in London. Cecily was not the mysterious socialite or the woman on the run that the papers had imagined. She was a daughter, a sister, and a professional. She had been working as a secretary, and her friends described her as a quiet, sensible, and somewhat reserved person. The news of her death devastated her family. They had believed she was simply away on a short holiday to clear her head. Cecily had recently been through a period of personal stress, nothing unusual for a young woman in the city, and had told her mother she wanted to see the sea. She had packed her bags, boarded a train from Paddington Station, and disappeared into the coastal mist. But as the police delved into Cecily's final days, the story took a darker turn. They managed to track her movements from London to Penzance. She had been seen arriving at the station, looking cheerful and carrying a small suitcase. She checked into a modest boarding house under her own name. For the first day or two, she was seen exploring the town alone. But on the Saturday before her body was found, witnesses reported seeing her in the company of a man. This mystery man became the central focus of the investigation. He was described as being in his mid-30s, of medium height, with a slim build and a somewhat academic or professional appearance. He wore plus fours, a style of trousers popular for hiking at the time, and a flat cap. Witnesses saw them together at a tea room, where they seemed to be in deep conversation. They were seen again walking along the cliff path toward Porthcurno. They looked, to any casual observer, like a couple enjoying a summer stroll. The police reconstructed the timeline of that final Sunday. Cecily had left her boarding house in the morning, telling the landlady she wouldn't be back for lunch. She was seen at the Porthcurno bus stop, and then, later in the afternoon, she was seen with the man in the plus fours near the very spot where her body would be found. What happened in those hidden crevices of cliff? The forensics of 1936 couldn't tell the full story, but the physical evidence suggested a struggle. Cecily had fought for her life. The man, whoever he was, had used immense force. After she was dead, He had seemingly taken the time to remove her belongings, her handbag, which likely contained her money and ID, and attempted to hide her body in the rocky fissure. The search for the man in the plus fours was exhaustive. The police checked every railway passenger, every bus driver, and every local resident. They released a composite description that was posted in every post office in the UK. Tips flooded in. People reported seeing him in Bristol, in London, in Southampton, but every lead turned into a dead end. He had vanished as if he had walked straight into the S. The investigation continued. The police began to look closer at Cecily's life in London. Was there a secret lover? A disgruntled acquaintance? They found that Cecily had been a member of various social clubs and had a wide circle of acquaintances, but no one who seemed to fit the profile of a killer. Her life was, by all accounts, remarkably ordinary. However, one detail emerged that piqued the interest of the detectives. Cecily had recently inherited a small sum of money, not a fortune, but enough to be significant in 1936. Had she been targeted for her savings? If so, the killer had gone to extraordinary lengths for a relatively small payoff. The removal of the clothing labels suggested a level of premeditation that went beyond a simple robbery gone wrong. It suggested someone who was intimately familiar with how police investigations worked, someone who knew that if a body couldn't be identified, the trail would go cold much faster. The inquest into Cecily Batten's death was held in Penzance. It was a media circus. The coroner's court was packed with journalists and locals, all hoping for a resolution to the mystery that had gripped the county. The medical evidence was presented in grim detail. The bruises, the marks on her neck, the trauma to her skull. The jury didn't take long to return a verdict of murder by a person or persons unknown. But despite the verdict, the person unknown remained just that. The man in the plus fours was never found. Some theorized he was a traveler, someone who had met Cecily on the train and charmed his way into her holiday. Others suggested he might have been someone from her past in London who had followed her down to Cornwall, waiting for the perfect moment when she was isolated on the cliffs. There was also a more chilling theory that circulated in the local pubs. At the time, Porthcurno was the hub of the British Empire's submarine telegraph cables. The Easter Telegraph Company had a massive station there, and the area was crawling with engineers and workers from all over the world. Could the killer have been someone working at the station? Someone who knew the cliffs intimately, who knew which gullies were rarely visited and which paths were hidden from view. The police questioned many of the workers, but no evidence ever linked any of them to Cecily. As the months turned into years, the Porthcurno mystery began to fade from the front pages. The dark clouds of World War II were gathering over Europe, and the death of one woman on a Cornish cliff seemed less significant in the face of global catastrophe. Cecily Batten was buried in a quiet grave, her name etched into a headstone that stood as a silent witness to a crime that would never be punished. Decades later, cold case investigators have looked back at the Porthcurno mystery with modern eyes. They've wondered if DNA could have solved it, or if modern psychological profiling could have identified the man in the plus fours. Some believe he was a serial predator, someone who used the anonymity of holiday resorts to find his victims. There were other similar disappearances and accidents along the English coast in the 1930s, but the lack of centralized records at the time made it impossible to link them. The mystery of Cecily Batten remains one of Cornwall's most enduring enigmas. The image of the woman in the green suit, lying in the granite heart of the cliffs, is a haunting reminder of how easily a life can be snuffed out and how a killer can disappear into the fabric of history. When you stand on the cliffs above Porthcurno today, looking out over the turquoise water toward Logan Rock, the beauty of the landscape is undeniable. But for those who know the story, there is a lingering shadow. The wind that whistles through the gullies seems to carry the echoes of a struggle from a summer long ago, and the rocks themselves seem to hold the secret of the man who walked away, leaving a mystery that time has refused to solve. Cecily Batten came to the coast for peace, for the healing power of the sea. Instead, she found a darkness that the bright Cornish sun couldn't penetrate. And the man in the plus fours? He remains a silhouette on the path, a ghost in the archives, the Phantom of Porthcurno. Next story, the murder of Rose Harsent. Peasenhall, Suffolk, 1902. The village of Peasenhall in Suffolk is, even today, the kind of place that feels preserved in amber. It is a cluster of flint-walled cottages and rolling farmland where, at the turn of the 20th century, the passage of time was measured by the seasons and the ringing of the church bells. In 1902, this was a community where everyone knew their neighbor's business, their parentage, and their reputation. It was a place where a scandal could be as damaging as a physical blow. On the morning of June 1st, 1902, a local man named William Burgess was walking toward Providence House, a modest but sturdy home where he worked as a laborer. The air was thick with the scent of early summer rain, following a night of violent thunderstorms that had rattled the window panes of every house in the valley. As Burgess approached the back door, he noticed something unusual. The door was slightly ajar. He called out for Rose. Rose Harsent was a 22-year-old domestic servant who lived and worked at Providence House for the Crisp family. She was known to be a hard-working, attractive young woman, active in the local Methodist choir. When no answer came, Burgess pushed the door open and stepped into the kitchen. The scene he encountered would haunt the village for the next century. At the foot of the stairs leading to her bedroom, Rose Harsent lay dead. She was dressed only in her nightgown. Her throat had been cut with such precision and force that she was nearly decapitated. There were further wounds to her body, and it was immediately apparent that she had fought for her life. Strangely, amidst the horror, there was a broken medicine bottle lying near her head, and the faint, medicinal smell of carbolic acid hung in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. The local police were summoned, and as they began their investigation, the idyllic facade of Peasenhall began to crumble. It didn't take long for the authorities to realize that Rose Harsent had been living a double life. In the drawers of her room, investigators found a collection of letters. They weren't the innocent correspondence of a young girl. They were passionate, clandestine, and deeply incriminating. The letters pointed directly to one man, William Gardner. Gardner was not a drifter or a known criminal. He was a pillar of the community. He was a foreman at the local drill works, a married man with 6 children, and a prominent member of the same Methodist chapel where Rose sang. He was a man who projected an image of stern, unshakable morality. But the letters suggested a dark, obsessive connection between the 35-year-old deacon and the young servant. The scandal hadn't actually started with the murder. A year prior, 2 local men claimed they had seen Gardner and Rose entering a local doctor's shed together late at night. The rumor had spread like wildfire, leading to an internal investigation by the church elders. At the time, Gardner had managed to talk his way out of it, maintaining his innocence and keeping his position of power. But the murder changed everything. When the police searched Rose's room, they found a letter she had received just days before her death. It was an invitation. It asked her to meet the sender at the usual place at midnight on May 31st, the night of the great storm. The handwriting was scrutinized, and to the eyes of the investigators, it bore a striking resemblance to William Gardner's. Furthermore, a medical examination of Rose's body revealed a second motive, one as old as time. Rose Harsent was 6 months pregnant. In a small, conservative village in 1901, an unmarried pregnant servant was a social pariah. But for a married deacon, a man of God in the eyes of his neighbors, being the father of that child was a death sentence for his reputation and his livelihood. If Rose had been pressuring him, or if the pregnancy was about to become impossible to hide, the motive for murder was absolute. The evidence against Gardner began to mount, though much of it was circumstantial. On the night of the murder, the storm had been so loud that many villagers claimed they heard nothing. However, one neighbor claimed to have seen a light flickering in the windows of Providence House at an hour when everyone should have been asleep. Another witness claimed to have seen a man matching Gardner's description walking toward the house through the rain. Then there was the matter of the medicine bottle. The broken glass found near Rose's body was identified as having once contained a mixture used for internal ailments. When the police searched Gardner's home, they found a similar bottle. Even more damning, They found a knife in his possession that was sharp enough to have inflicted the wounds, though it had been cleaned thoroughly. Gardner was arrested and brought to trial at the Ipswich Assizes in November 1902. The case became a national sensation. It had all the hallmarks of a Victorian melodrama: a secret pregnancy, a double living deacon, a midnight meeting during a thunderstorm, and a brutal, bloody end. The prosecution's case was built on the letters and the alleged affair. They argued that Gardner had gone to the house to silence Rose, bringing the carbolic acid either to force her to end the pregnancy or as a misguided attempt to cleanse the situation before turning to violence. They painted him as a man desperate to protect his social standing at any cost. However, Gardner had a formidable defense. He remained stoic, almost arrogant, on the stand. His wife, in a display of loyalty that baffled the public, provided him with an alibi. She swore that her husband had been in bed with her all night, claiming that the storm was so terrifying they had stayed close together for comfort. The jury deliberated for hours. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. When they returned, they announced they were deadlocked. 11 men were convinced of his guilt, but one man held out. He refused to believe that a man of Gardner's standing could be capable of such butchery without a direct witness. A second trial was ordered in January 1903. This time, the defense turned the tables. They attacked Rose's character, suggesting that as a young woman with loose morals, evidenced by her pregnancy, she could have had any number of suitors. They suggested the handwriting on the letters could have been forged, or that Rose had been seeing someone else entirely. The second jury was even more divided. After another grueling deliberation, they returned the same result: a stalemate. Under the laws of the time, after two hung juries, the prosecution had to make a choice. Seeing that a conviction was becoming increasingly unlikely in the face of such polarized public opinion, they entered a nolle prosequi, a formal notice that they would not proceed with the charges. William Gardner walked out of the court a free man, but he was a man without a home. The village of Peasenhall, once his kingdom, was now a place of whispers and sidelong glances. He and his family eventually packed their belongings and disappeared, changing their names and moving to South London to start a new life in obscurity. The mystery of Rose Harsent, however, refused to disappear. For over 100 years, historians and amateur sleuths have picked over the bones of the case. Was it Gardner? The evidence of the letters and the motive of the pregnancy seem overwhelming. Yet, some point to the lack of blood found on his clothing. If he had committed such a visceral, close-quarters murder, he should have been drenched. Could he have committed the act naked, as some theorists suggest, washing himself in the rain before returning home? Others look toward a different suspect: the village idiot or a jealous, unknown suitor. There was even a theory involving the Crisp family themselves, the owners of the house, though no evidence ever supported it. The most haunting detail remains the broken bottle of carbolic acid. In those days, carbolic acid was sometimes used in desperate, dangerous attempts to induce a miscarriage. It raises the question: did Rose invite someone there to help her? Did a botched attempt at a medical intervention turn into a panic murder? Or was the acid brought by someone who intended to poison her, only to find that steel was more certain? Today, Rose Harsent lies in the Peasenhall churchyard. Her gravestone is simple, providing no hint of the violence that ended her life or the scandal that rocked the nation. Providence House still stands, a quiet residence on a quiet street. Next story: the fall of the Lion of Damascus. Cairo, Egypt, 1800. The Egyptian sun in June is a heavy physical weight. In the year 1800, Cairo was a city of shifting shadows, narrow limestone alleys, and a simmering, quiet resentment that the French occupation force could feel but never quite touch. At the center of this tension stood one man, Jean-Baptiste Kleber. He was a giant, both in physical stature and military reputation. Napoleon Bonaparte had recently slipped away back to France, leaving Kleber with a dwindling army, a hostile population, and a monumental task of holding onto a dream of empire that was rapidly turning into a nightmare. Kleber was a man of the Enlightenment, a seasoned soldier who preferred the clarity of a battlefield to the murky politics of occupation. He was often seen walking through the gardens of his headquarters in Cairo, his towering frame and thick mane of hair making him instantly recognizable. He was the Lion of Damascus, a hero of the Rhine, but in the heat of Egypt, he was a target. On the morning of June 14th, Kleber was in a relatively good mood. He had been reviewing repairs on his residence and was walking toward the house of a colleague for lunch. He wasn't alone. He was accompanied by an architect named Protain. They walked through the lush, shaded greenery of the garden, discussing construction and logistics. Kleber, confident and perhaps overly comfortable in his position of power, did not have a heavy guard with him. He was a man who believed in the strength of his own presence. But as they approached a walled-off section of the garden, the atmosphere changed. Out of the shadows of a neglected summer house stepped a young man. He looked like many of the other wanderers or students from the nearby university, disheveled, weary, and seemingly harmless. He approached the general with the posture of a beggar, his hand outstretched as if seeking a petition or a blessing. Kleber, used to such interruptions, paused. It was a fatal moment of hesitation. The young man didn't produce a petition. Instead, he drew a long, sharpened dagger. Before the general's seasoned reflexes could kick in, the blade was driven deep into his chest. Kleber stumbled back, gasping, but the attacker was relentless. He struck again and again, 4 times in total, ensuring that the Lion of Cairo would not rise. Protain, the architect, tried to intervene, wielding only a small measuring stick, but he was quickly slashed and beaten back. The attacker didn't stay to celebrate. He vanished back into the labyrinthine gardens, leaving the commander of the French army of the East bleeding out on the sand. Within minutes, the garden was swarming with French soldiers. The news hit the city like a thunderclap. The commander was dead. The man who had been the wall between the French army and total collapse was gone. The search for the killer was immediate and frantic. The French authorities knew that if they didn't find the culprit, the entire city might rise in revolt, emboldened by the strike against the heart of the occupation. They found him hiding in a nearby garden, buried under some brush and palm branches. He wasn't a professional soldier, nor was he a local insurgent. His name was Suleiman al-Halabi, a 24-year-old student from Aleppo. The questioning that followed was brutal. The French, desperate for answers, wanted to know who had sent him. Was it the British? Was it the Ottoman Sultan? Suleiman initially remained silent, but under the heavy pressure of physical force, he began to speak. He claimed he had traveled from Syria on a mission of religious and nationalistic duty. He had spent weeks living in a local place of worship, sharpening his blade and watching Kleber's movements. He told his captors that he was a lone actor, motivated by the suffering of his people under foreign rule. Though he eventually implicated several teachers from the university who he claimed had known of his intent, but did nothing to stop him. The French reaction was a mixture of grief and calculated terror. They needed to make an example of Suleiman. This wasn't just a killing, it was a political earthquake. The trial was swift and conducted under military law. The sentence handed down was designed to be as public and as horrific as possible, meant to frighten the population of Cairo into submission. Suleiman was sentenced to have his hand burned, followed by an agonizingly slow death on a wooden stake. His execution was carried out in public, lasting for hours under the same scorching sun that had watched the attack in the garden. He reportedly showed a calmness that unnerved his executioners, reciting prayers until his voice finally failed him. But the death of Kleber did more than just claim one life. It effectively ended the French dream in Egypt. Kleber's successor lacked the charisma, the tactical brilliance, and the respect of the troops. Without Kleber's leadership, the French forces became demoralized and isolated. Within a year, they would surrender to the British and Ottoman forces, retreating from the land of the pharaohs forever. The story of Kleber's end is often overshadowed by the larger story of Napoleon's rise, but it remains one of the most significant what-if moments in history. Had Kleber lived, the French might have negotiated a more favorable exit or even held onto their position. Instead, the blade of a lone student changed the map of the Middle East and the path of the wars in Europe. Today, If you visit the Museum of Mankind in Paris, you can find the skull of Suleiman al-Halabi. It was taken back to France by the retreating army as a specimen, a grim trophy of a campaign that began with the promise of discovery and ended in the dust of a Cairo garden. The Lion of Damascus was gone, and the empire he served was not far behind.